Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to this press conference with Mr. Abdel-Hamid Mamdouh of Egypt. Before giving Mr. Mamdouh the floor, a few housekeeping points. This press conference involves journalists who are participating in person and also via WebEx. If you are participating via WebEx and would like to ask a question, please raise your hand by pressing the icon at the bottom of your screen. I would also be grateful if all journalists would please identify themselves and their news organization before taking the floor. Interpretation in the room will be provided in English, French, and Spanish. The complete bio for Mr. Mamdouh is available now on the WTO website, and the statement he has just delivered to the General Counsel will be on the site very soon. Mr. Mamdouh will give a brief opening statement, and then we will take your questions. We will have precisely 30 minutes for this press conference. Mr. Mamdouh, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Keith, and thank you everyone for being here. I just finished my meeting with the General Counsel, encompassing the 164 members of the WTO, and what I was delivering to them was the logic of why I am here, why I'm running for this post, but also what I think I can bring to the table. And in brief, what I bring to this process of selection now is my 35 years of experience in the multilateral trading system, starting as a negotiator for Egypt when we started the Uruguay round, the biggest and most fundamental reform project in the history of the multilateral system, which transformed the GATT into the WTO. And in that reform process, a lot of experiences and a lot of lessons that come rushing back to memory now when I look at the WTO and look at the challenges that the organization is facing and the existential crisis that it is going through. I also gave my vision about what went wrong with the WTO, why are we in the situation we're in today. I referred specifically to the chronic imbalance in the fundamental vital functions of the organization, the three pillars, dispute settlement, negotiation, and the regular functions of transparency and deliberation. And the analogy I used for the WTO system was that of a tripod, that the system stands on those three legs, and there has to be weight distribution balance across the three legs. But what we have seen over the past 25 years was that the dispute settlement function gained strength because of the automaticity of procedures, while the other functions have subsided completely. And particularly the negotiating function breakdown is causing huge difficulties for the organization. And like any legal system, there has to be a balance between the judiciary and the legislative. And for the WTO legal system, that is the balance between the negotiating function and the dispute settlement function. But that was my perspective about what went wrong, and then that feeds into how do we fix it? And how do we fix it? Because we all talk about reform, but there's very little said about what kind of reforms we need. I explained a number of elements, but I stressed the nature of the reform we're talking about, that reforming the WTO is not like reforming any other international organization. This is not about restructuring departments or reallocating resources across different projects or different country programs. This is about reforming the treaty, and the treaty is that enforceable contract between governments. And the only way reform can take place is through negotiations. There were so many questions from the membership, and the whole session took about an hour and a half. Now, the last point I would like to stress here with you is how important I think the media is. You are playing a critical role in providing the public with information, factual information, but also, of course, your analysis are always welcome. And the technological development that we are witnessing now because of COVID-19 is also expanding the reach of your tools across borders in ways that I think are going to stay with us from now on. So with that, thank you very much, Keith, and back to you.
Thank you very much. Let's start with a question from Laurent. Vous avez la parole, Laurent.
Thank you, Laurent Siro, Swiss News Agency. Good to see you again. You recently said that you have a unique profile to offer to member states, not having been a minister and not being a minister. Could you fill in the Q&A session any either interest or concern for that unique profile from the member states?
I did not detect any concern. I explained in all sincerity and honesty why. I see a fundamental difference between the mindset of a minister who is by definition an executive who executes a policy agenda and who advocates a certain line and does that so often in the face of opposition and sometimes in the negotiations in the face of other ministers. A minister always takes a national perspective. The WTO Director-General is an honest broker, and he must have a different mindset. Political leadership is necessary for the WTO, but I say that political leadership is not always synonymous with ministerial leadership. But I did not detect any kind of objection to that.
Thank you. Bryce, you have the floor, please.
Bryce Bashik with Bloomberg News. Thank you for attending this press conference. Wanted to ask you, can you say in a succinct way, what is your vision for fixing the WTO, and what is your strategy for accomplishing that? Thank you.
You said succinct, right? Well, all I can say in a few seconds really is the way to fix the WTO has to start with recalling the common sense of purpose on which this system was based. Why are we here? We need to recall that. We're not going to talk about the importance of trade because we know that already. But why are we here? And what is the purpose of the WTO? The WTO is not an objective in itself. It serves a purpose. So can we go back to that sense of purpose? And the first thing I would do is to revive the negotiating function and the ability of people to come around the table and talk to each other, not at each other, with less emotions, less politicization, more fact-based knowledge about the problems, and more trust.
Let's take a question from WebEx. It's Hannah Monacan from Inside U.S. Trade. Hannah, you have the floor, please.
Hello, Hannah Monacan, Inside U.S. Trade. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Good to chat with you again. You are now running against two other accomplished African candidates. I know that the region initially had hoped to unite behind one candidate. Do you think this will make it difficult for you to secure African support, or more broadly, the eventual consensus support that you will require?
Thank you, Hannah, for the question. I think what is the position of the Egyptian government now is that the Egyptian candidate, and this is a matter of fact, this is not a matter of interpretation, the Egyptian candidate is the only candidate of the three Africans who has been endorsed by the Executive Council of the African Union. Now, of course, that is the African process. What is happening here in the WTO does not depend on what happens in Addis Ababa. But in terms of characterization or description, I think the respectable, honorable candidates from Kenya and Nigeria have not passed through the processes and procedures of the African Union as the Egyptian candidate did.
We have a WhatsApp question from Sumaya Keynes from The Economist. Do you think there needs to be any change in the role of the WTO Secretariat and their interactions with members?
Well, I believe that the WTO Secretariat can play a more useful role than it is playing now. We have an extraordinary world-class body of expertise and knowledge in the WTO Secretariat, and it needs to be put at the disposal of the membership. Now, of course, the WTO is member-driven, but the Secretariat has historically played a critical role in bringing before the membership the information, the analysis that they need in order to conduct their business, particularly in the areas of negotiations as well in the areas of analyzing new issues, things like e-commerce, trade and environment, and many others. And that role needs to be revived. Of course, the WTO is member-driven, but the Secretariat plays an extremely valuable role. And in my view, if I am chosen as Director General, I would do everything I can to bring that role of the Secretariat back to where it was in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For Christian Ulrich, please.
Hello, I have two questions, but very short ones. Is there a particular Egyptian vision that you bring to the table that makes you stand apart from everyone else? Is there something that you, with your experience as an Egyptian, have to offer? And the second one is, don't you think it's time, although your candidacy, of course, is very valuable, don't you think it's time for a woman to lead an organization like this one? Thank you.
Thank you. My Egyptian perspective actually is that of a developing country facing all the challenges, but also my personal Egyptian perspective is that of an Egyptian negotiator who came here to Geneva in 1985, struggling to navigate through the new issues and challenges then faced by the GATT system. We were faced with issues we haven't heard about before. We've never heard about trade and services. We're talking about 85. And for us, for an Egyptian, and not just an Egyptian, but most countries, services were government functions performed by public utility entities. So to talk about trade and services was a daunting conceptual challenge to deal with. So I understand, as an Egyptian negotiator, what negotiators from developing countries and least developed countries face by way of challenges in terms of negotiating capacity. Is this the time for a woman to lead? Any time is the time for a woman to lead, of course. One of my points that I raised is that I believe firmly in gender equality and diversity. But there is a question also about looking at the necessary attributes as opposed to the desirable attributes. And of course, I would bow in respect for the selection of a woman. I would caution, however, if that becomes the primary criterion, as opposed to a desirable criterion, then my point here would be to just act in the best interest of the organization.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Ling Xin from Xinhua. You have the floor, Xin.
Thank you, Keith. Good afternoon, Mr. Mamdouh. Xin from Xinhua News Agency. My question is, you participated in the negotiations and the drafting of the General Agreement on Trade and Services 25 years ago. According to your personal experience, what is the key to have the consensus among all members to reach an agreement? And if selected as the Director General, what's your specific plan to help build the consensus? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The key to consensus is, in my view, two things. First of all, mobilize the support for a common purpose. Common purpose. You need to define the purpose of what we're doing in order to facilitate convergence. If we don't clarify that, I think we're going nowhere. It's like the analogy that I was drawing in the General Council now is that I feel like we are in the same boat, but we're not rowing in the same direction. So you need to have a common sense of purpose and direction. The thing about consensus also, which I've learned from that experience, is that consensus is the golden rule for how this organization functions. But I would say let's be careful not to impose a consensus requirement where it's not needed and where it's not required. And there are situations where a consensus decision is not required. So I would caution against inflicting that hurdle on processes that do not require it. And if you follow these two parameters, I think that facilitates consensus as we go.
Thank you. And here's a question on from WhatsApp. It's from Florencia Carboni from Trade News in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The question is, what do you think should be the role of the United States and China in the new WTO?
Well, the role of the U.S. and China in the new WTO is to engage in the WTO and start from the point that the bilateral tensions between the U.S. and China, in my view, should be resolved in the WTO. The WTO should be seen as part of the solution, not part of the problem. And also we have to keep in mind that since we all believe in the multilateral system, and I believe that the U.S. does believe in the multilateral system, as well as China, then we also have to keep in mind that bilateral tensions do not only have bilateral effects, and bilateral solutions would have ramifications for others as well. But I would also suggest that bilateral solutions are, by definition, more transactional and less principled, and are more likely to be short-lived than sustainable. So the role that they would play, as I would suggest to both of them, is to let's calm down the political tensions and the emotions, and let's come to the WTO and see how we can deal with those differences while engaging other members as well. In my view, this is not just a bilateral problem.
Okay. We've got another WebEx question. This is from Ayana Dreyer from Bordelex. Ayana, you have the floor, please.
Hello, thank you, Keith. Mr. Mamdouh, I have a question. What concretely would you do to fix the appellate body or revive it? Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. The first step here would be to build on the good work that has already been done. There's a lot of work that was done by the chairman of the dispute settlement body last year, Ambassador David Walker. It has gone a long way. Some members think it wasn't sufficient, but I think the most logical and most productive first step is to build on that work and see what else is needed, and look deeper into the problem, because I think the problem relates to some of the legal and regulatory different cultures between different countries. So we need to get into to the bottom of the problem. But also, I would note here that I have not yet heard any suggestion that the rules governing disputes should be changed. So that already is a good start. Nobody is suggesting that we should amend the dispute settlement understanding. So I think the size of the problem needs to be put in perspective. It's not existential, and we're not starting from zero as well. There is a lot of work done that we can build on.
Thank you. The next question is for Hao Kian of SINA. You have the floor, please.
Mr. Mamdouh, my question is about globalization, which we have discussed recently very often, that people believe maybe the golden age of globalization has already passed. And given the fact that the protectionism and nationalism has been a new trend in Europe and in US, in many countries, like what we have seen. So do you believe that we couldn't come back to the best age of globalization? How you are going to do that if you being elected as the new DG of WTO? Thank you.
Thank you. I think globalization has been in transition for a while. Of course, COVID-19 has faced us with more abrupt changes, but I think globalization, in my view, is not going to go anywhere. Yes, there has been some tendencies towards more protectionism. Even global value chains now are being questioned. But I would caution here, let's put things in perspective. Let's move away from the panic analysis caused by COVID-19. And what we have been seeing is quite informative, and we need to draw the lesson properly, in my view. The problems that we have seen during COVID-19 were actually related to certain categories of products. We're talking about two types of products, medical products and food products. And the problem, we need to have, again, a good diagnostic of the problem so that we think of the right solution. The problem with global value chains during COVID-19 were problems of disruption of supply. So if what we're trying to solve really is problems of resilience and securing supply, then the solution might not be in domesticating value chains and onshoring production activities. The solution to secure supply might lie actually in diversifying value chains and diversifying sources of supply, as opposed to narrowing down supply or domesticating it. In terms of globalization as a whole, I think it is growing. It's not going anywhere. It is restructuring. I remember there were studies done at the end of 2018 about how global value chains are restructuring. The location of production is now being determined based on different factors. It's less based on cheap labor. It's more located closer to consumption markets. The rising consumption trends in emerging economies and rising purchasing power of consumers is determining now the location of production operations of certain lines of products. Of course, and it will continue to evolve in terms of structure. It will continue to evolve. But deglobalization, I don't believe in it.
Okay, we have a question from Mustafa Abdel Azim from the Al Etihad newspaper in the United Arab Emirates. The question is, from your perspective, what is the top challenge facing the WTO and what is your first priority?
Well, the top challenge facing the WTO is the fading common purpose, the fading sense of common purpose. Because if we lose that, then the WTO is lost. What I would do, the most urgent thing that I would do, is to do everything I can to revive that common sense of purpose, and immediately with that, revive the negotiating function of the organization. And by the negotiating function, by the way, I don't mean just the market access and liberalization negotiations or subsidies negotiations. I mean the ability of WTO members to come around the table and talk productively with each other, not at each other.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Any more questions from the floor? Don't see any. Oh, sorry. Yes, please. Thank you right there. Sorry. And yes, sorry, the lights are quite bright. Go ahead. And yes, you have the floor.
Yes, hi, hello, good to meet you again. So the next Director General might come maybe in October, November, we don't know. Do you think it gives enough time to have a ministerial next year? And do you think if you will be the next Director General, you will have time to build something strong for this ministerial?
I think if it happens October, November, I think there will be time. Because I think we need to be clear that the next ministerial has to be a turning point where we move the WTO into positive territory. And by that I mean we need to, that's my own view, of course, and it won't mean much unless members are convinced. But my view is that there are two things we need to do at MC12. The first is to have a clear agenda for reform discussions. And by that I mean not just a list of items, but an agenda with real content and a description of what kind of process. Because until today, there is no mainstream reform process in the WTO. WTO reform is being discussed in many places, but not really in the WTO except on ad hoc basis when certain issues come to the General Council, like the appellate body, special and differential treatment, or transparency and notifications, and so on. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is to score real progress on ongoing negotiations, and particularly fisheries subsidies conclusion would be the first target. And there are ongoing negotiations on e-commerce, on domestic regulation and services, on investment facilitation, on MISMEs. There I would see some concrete progress marked at MC12, not conclusion, but concrete progress that gives a clear idea about the road ahead and when a time frame for conclusion may be foreseen.
Mr. Mamdouh, I'd like to thank you very much for participating in this press conference. I'd like to thank all of you for attending, those of you who are here personally and those of you attending via other forms. So thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. We'll have a full slate of press conferences again tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.